Welcome to Revolution Revisited, your crash course in the American Revolution. As the 250th anniversary of America's independence approaches, dive into the stories of Virginia's rebels, rule breakers, and rabble-rousers who shaped a nation. This podcast is brought to you by the Virginia Museum of History and Culture and made possible by William and Karen Fralin.
Welcome back to Revolution Revisited, your crash course in the American Revolution. I'm your host, Maggie Creech. Today, we are finally, making it into the year 1775. As we've seen across the last few episodes, 1774's call for peaceful resolutions had largely been exhausted, and the situation was rapidly approaching a breaking point. The colonies were on the cusp of rebellion. Today, we're exploring those flashpoints that mark the shift from diplomacy to armed conflict. To help us unpack this revolutionary spring of 1775, we're joined by Sam Florer, Manager of Public Programs here at the VMHC.
My name is Sam Florer. I'm the Manager of Public Programs here at the Virginia Museum of History and Culture. I have worked in museum education for my whole career, and I especially love the American Revolution.
On our last episode, we left off at the First Continental Congress. How does the time between the First Continental Congress and the Second Virginia Convention begin to deepen the divide and the conversations between Great Britain and the colonies? Well, the colonists passed those boycott resolutions in the fall of 1774, but making sure it stuck required a lot of effort, especially in a society where the threat of British retribution was always looming. What made the boycott successful was the creation of local committees of safety, essentially community-level enforcement agencies. These committees were made up of the political elites in local communities, like landowners and legislators, who formed these unofficial bodies to enforce the boycott. They took matters into their own hands, organizing the local resistance against British goods, and importantly, making sure that everyone adhered to the boycott through both persuasion and, sometimes when needed, force.
So after the First Continental Congress and throughout the fall and winter of 1774 leading into 1775, the most important thing that's happening is the colonists are enacting what they discussed at the Continental Congress, which was the boycott of importing British goods. So talking about this boycott is one thing, but implementing it is a whole another task. And it actually starts to put into action these revolutionary words and rhetoric. In Virginia and many of these other colonies, the local colonists are very successful in their boycott implementation. And they're doing this by setting up what are called local committees of safety. And so these local committees most of them are elected by their local communities. They're leaders of those communities, so people who would be serving in the colonial legislatures, already kind of the political leaders of these areas, are now elected to these extra legal bodies. So these are not approved by the crown. They're not approved by the governor. They are really these grassroots organizations. And they're the ones that are going to be implementing this boycott by making sure merchants are not importing things, making sure people, planters, homeowners are not purchasing things as well. And these committees are given the power by their local communities to enforce this boycott by investigations and with the kind of implicit threat of violence and military force. It all is on a local and case-by-case basis. Most of the time, there isn't a lot of violence happening, but that kind of implicit threat that violence might occur does go a long way in making people follow this boycott. You see between 1774 and 1775, the importation of British goods really falls off a cliff in the colonies. And they are extremely effective in boycotting British goods.
Across classes, the colonists are embracing this pushback to the crown and are willing to sacrifice some things in the name of this collective boycott.
This boycott does a really good job of making these big ideas and rhetoric about revolution, making them local and making them real on the ground for everyday colonists. And while there is, I think, some of that resentment that these local committees of safety are by far and away elite landowners, they are the the 1% coming together just as they were in the colonial legislatures before the revolution. At the same time, though, there isn't a lot of resistance to this boycott and to these threats. So it also shows that while most of the paper record is from the elite of the colonies, and that's where we get these great quotes and these big ideas, it also shows that once they start to implement this boycott, there is actually quite a bit of groundswell support for this boycott. Otherwise, I think you would have seen a lot more resistance to it. You would have seen a lot more people breaking and going around the boycott. And that's what happened in previous boycotts. After the Stamp Act, after these earlier taxations, British tax policy, where the colonists tried to get together and implement boycotts, it wasn't very successful because there wasn't local organizations implementing it and making sure people were following it. And I don't think there was as much of on-the-ground support for it because this was earlier on in the revolution, earlier on in the conflict between the colonies and England. By 1774 and 1775, this had been going on for a long time, and resentment was building and building in the colonies. And so more and more local people were willing to get on board. And you can see from average, everyday merchants who are having to follow this, even Thomas Jefferson gets caught up in it. He has to report to the local Albemarle Committee of Safety to explain why he had ordered window sashes from England to install at Monticello. And he apologized because he had ordered them before the boycott was agreed to. He thought they would arrive before the boycott went into implementation. But because of shipping delays, they were showing up after the boycott had begun. And so he had to apologize and say he wouldn't install them. He would send them back. He would cancel the order. And so you can see that Thomas Jefferson, this leader of these revolutionary ideas, one of the people pushing to implement this boycott, is kind of in this gray area of whether he's following it or not.
In the time immediately following the First Continental Congress, not only are local enforcement committees formed, the colonies are also forming military organizations. The Suffolk Resolves endorsed the formation of these militias.
In Virginia, they called these independent companies. In New England, they were called Minutemen. And these are local armed groups who are coming together outside of the regular colonial militia formation. So they're basically forming their own parallel revolutionary militias. And those were those groups that were kind of that implicit threat, use of force against people breaking the boycott. To show just how influential these groups were, when Lord Dunmore returns to Williamsburg after leading armed forces against the Shawnee Indians on the Virginia frontier in what's known as Lord Dunmore's War, he returns in December of 1775, and he writes to Lord Dartmouth, the Secretary of the Colonies in London. He writes, quote, "Every county, besides, is now arming a company of men, whom they call an independent company, for the avowed purpose of protecting their committees, and to be employed against government if occasion requires." So Dunmore is now recognizing that there is an armed body explicitly outside of his control. So you can see how quickly things have gone from talk to now action of not only this boycott, but armed men that are no longer under the control of the governor being used for revolutionary purposes. This is the mood moving into 1775, is one very much moving from rhetoric and talk into action with these committees of safety and these independent companies.
The Virginia Museum of History and Culture presents Give Me Liberty, Virginia and the Forging of a Nation. Commemorating 250 years since the Declaration of Independence, this exhibition explores Virginia's central role in the American Revolution. Through iconic moments, ordinary lives, and contested ideals, discover how Virginians shaped a new model of democratic government that changed the world. Opens March 22nd. Tickets at virginiahistory.org.
In January 1775, Peyton Randolph, who had presided over the First Virginia Convention, made the call for a Second Virginia Convention to meet in March. The First Continental Congress had wrapped up in Philadelphia a few months earlier, approving this colony-wide boycott and supporting militias to prepare for a potential war. Now, Virginia's leaders needed to discuss where they stood on all of it. Basically, they needed to convene to co-sign what the Virginia delegates had already agreed to, and they needed to elect new delegates to give them instructions for the upcoming Second Continental Congress in May. But there was a problem. London had made it clear that they didn't want these meetings happening, and they definitely didn't want delegates being elected. Lord Dunmore was back in Williamsburg and had explicit orders to prevent the election of delegates to the Continental Congress. Meeting there, just down the street from him, wasn't an option.
In August of 1774, it was easy to hold an illegal meeting in Williamsburg to talk about resistance to British authority because British authority was not in Williamsburg at that time. Dunmore himself was leading the militia army on the frontier against the Native Americans. And so it was quite easy for them to meet there. They actually met in the House of Burgesses, which is an interesting thought, to have this revolutionary meeting in the actual house, the seat of British power in Virginia. So in March of 1775, Dunmore is back. He is in Williamsburg. And in fact, he had recently received orders from London ordering him to prevent the election of delegates to the Second Continental Congress. That was a very public thing. At the end of the First Continental Congress, they said, we are going to reconvene on May the 10th unless Parliament basically apologizes and rescinds all of these policies that we're upset about. And unless they do that, we're going to reconvene to talk about what our next actions are. So authorities in London, authorities all over the colonies know this meeting is coming up, and they know that all of the colonies are going to have their local meetings to re-elect their delegates. Dunmore has explicit orders to prevent this election, and he is in Williamsburg. They definitely don't want to risk meeting right down the street from where he is. They decide to meet in Richmond. It's a central meeting location, easy for everyone from across the colony to get to. They meet in Henrico Parish Church, basically because it's the biggest place where they can all meet and have like an easy conversation with one another. Important to note that it's not this like big fancy church that we think of at this time. It's very much just like a local county church. And the convention is very well attended. Between 95 and 120 delegates that meet over a week, March 20th to March 27th, 1775. That's a much larger number than what met at the first Virginia Convention, because remember, that is in the summer of 1774 when Virginia is fighting a war against Native Americans on the frontier. And so many of the leaders of those western frontier counties are not able to attend the convention because they're serving in the militia. So now there's no longer an active war happening. There's a war on the horizon, but that allows a much higher attendance rate. And so it's all of the big names, George Washington, Thomas Jefferson, Edmund Pendleton, Peyton Randolph, are all attending this meeting, including Patrick Henry, which will become very quickly kind of the star of this meeting.
For a week, nearly 120 delegates packed into the Henrico Parish Church, or what we know it as today, St. John's Church. At first, the discussions were mostly procedural, but by the end of the week, one speech, Patrick Henry's, would take center stage and make history.
So the first couple days are pretty boring. They really are just going over what the First Continental Congress discussed. They are reading over the minutes, which have been published in the newspapers. All of the delegates that went to the First Continental Congress are there at the Second Virginia Convention, so they're able to share their insights. And basically, the convention is approving of the work of the First Continental Congress. They're endorsing what happened. And that kind of dominates the first couple days of their meetings.
On March 23rd, 1775, the fourth day of the convention, Patrick Henry introduced 3 provocative resolutions.
Then Patrick Henry will introduce the most controversial, the really meat and potatoes of this meeting, with 3 resolutions that he proposes the convention approves of. All 3 of these resolutions have to do with military preparations. One says that the existence of a disciplined and organized militia is important because that means that British soldiers don't need to be stationed in the colonies, which means the colonists don't have to pay taxes to pay for the existence of those soldiers in America. So that idea of the existence and the investment in a strong militia, Henry is arguing, negates a lot of the issues that the colonists have with British policy in North America at the time. His next resolution throws some shade at Lord Dunmore. Lord Dunmore had dissolved the House of Burgesses in May of 1774 after they had declared a day of fasting and prayer in sympathy with the people of Boston after the coercive acts went into effect. He dissolves the House of Burgesses, and they are dissolved throughout the rest of that year going into 1775. At the same time that they're dissolved, many of the militia laws of the colony of Virginia are set to expire. And so in these colonist eyes, Dunmore, they kind of see a nefarious reason behind this. They think Dunmore is doing this on purpose, maybe, that he is dissolving the Burgesses right before they need to reactivate, reapprove these militia laws. So he's trying to, like, on purpose weaken and make them less prepared to resist any potential conflict. It's kind of debatable whether that is true or not, but he throws shade and says, if we were allowed to meet, we would be able to reapprove of our militia laws, but we haven't been able to do that. So we especially need them right now. And then the third resolution is the most inflammatory of them all. He states that the convention should approve that this, quote, this colony be immediately put into a posture of defense, and called for the embodying, arming, and disciplining such a number of men as may be sufficient for that purpose. So he is now explicitly saying that Virginia is in a time of conflict and that we need to raise our own militia to be able to prepare for this conflict and respond to this conflict. So he is explicitly calling for arming of revolutionary militias to be in ready posture to start resisting British authority. With this resolution, Henry is trying to codify what had already been happening. After the First Virginia Convention, as the First Continental Congress is meeting, these local committees of safety are forming. And in some of these counties, they're also forming independent companies. But they are not doing that following any explicit overarching order. They're kind of just doing this grassroots on their own. This is an important development because now if the convention ratifies this resolution, they are saying as a colony-wide extra-legal body, we endorse all colonies, all counties in the colony of Virginia to start forming these independent companies. And again, all outside of governor control.
This is a big vibe shift from the First Continental Congress. Up until this point, there have been protests and there have been resolutions, but at every stop, it did appear that, in theory, if the king were to be amenable or if Parliament would be amenable to the colonist cause, then there was a way to find a peaceful resolution.
That is what makes Henry such an important figure during this whole period, is because he is the loudest, most eloquent voice saying that we need to stop talking about moderation, that we need to take the next step towards arming ourselves and resisting British authority with arms. And his reasoning is that British authority has already started to oppress them, colonists, with arms. So at the Second Virginia Convention, after Henry introduces his resolutions, many people in the audience who are more moderate than Henry are aghast. They are very taken aback, and they argue very strongly against his resolutions. They say, if we pass these resolutions, we will be the aggressors, and that will negate all of our arguments. Colonists, their big argument is that they are being oppressed, that they are on the defensive, that the British authorities are the ones aggressing against them. So the moderates believe that Henry's resolutions are too aggressive, they're too radical, and they worry what this is going to do for public opinion. especially back in England, where there are many members of Parliament who are very sympathetic to the colonists, who do believe Parliament and the current administration of England are being too oppressive and are being too militant against the colonists. So they're worried that this might disrupt things. Henry anticipated these arguments, as you might think he would. He's a very astute politician, and he, in his very famous speech, where he lays out all of the reasons why they need to pass this resolution, he directly addresses those moderates. And he says, peace, peace, you are calling for peace, but there is no peace. Peace does not exist right now. We are already at a time of war. He's very prophetic, because in the speech, he also says, quote, the next gale that sweeps from the north will bring to our ears the clash of resounding arms. So he is saying that in Boston and Massachusetts, where the British Army has close to 4,000 soldiers and they've closed down the port of Boston, that it is only a matter of time before armed conflict breaks out. And so we need to not wait until that happens. We need to be prepared before that happens. And he is very right. In less than a month, the Battle of Lexington and Concord happens. So it is quite interesting that Henry explicitly says that. And the next big news they hear from Boston is the Battle of Lexington and Concord. In the body of his speech, he's laying out his argument as to why this resolution needs to be passed. He's laying out his argument why reconciliation is no longer possible. He's laying out his argument why he believes the state of war has already begun in the colonies. But he ends with a plea to rhetoric and a plea to the emotions of his fellow convention members. He says, quote, is life so dear or peace so sweet as to be purchased at the price of chains and slavery? Forbid it, Almighty God. I know not what course others may take, but as for me, give me liberty or give me death. And as he says those words, he also uses his hands, puts his hands up in chains, and then falls to the floor, breaking them.
Patrick Henry's "Give me liberty or give me death" is one of the most famous lines in American history. But here's the thing. We don't actually have an exact record of what he said that day. No one wrote it down in the moment, and the version we know today wasn't published until decades later. However, historians can agree that despite the uncertainty, that final line was almost certainly part of the speech. The liberty or death slogan spread beyond Virginia, showing up on flags, uniforms, and pamphlets across the colonies within weeks. And while Henry's ideas weren't necessarily unique, leaders in other colonies were having the same conversations. His delivery made all the difference. It was really like the viral soundbite of the day.
He was a master at drawing his audience in with this big rhetoric, and also with his movements and his voice. He would get quieter and then explode into the end of his speech. And by all accounts, the speech was very impactful. After he finished giving it, the room was silent because everybody was shocked at his performance. And it was very effective as well, because when they went to then vote on his resolutions, they pass. When before, I think it was much more likely that they would have not passed, that the moderates would have carried the room. So I think his speech was able to convince many people in the room to vote his way. But importantly, it wasn't overwhelmingly effective, because while his resolutions passed, they only passed by a handful of votes. So it's important to keep that in mind, too. We only think about the resolutions passing, and we only think about his big words. But if maybe just a few of those men in the room were not convinced by his rhetoric, maybe the speech would not have been as famous as it went on to be.
Henry's threats of chains and slavery did not go unnoticed by Virginia's population of enslaved people. As tensions mounted with British authorities, Virginia's more than 200,000 enslaved people, roughly 40% of the population, took advantage of the chaos. In the spring of 1775, rumors of slave rebellion suddenly appeared across the colony, including James City County, Surry County, Chesterfield, Prince Edward, Northumberland, Norfolk, and even Williamsburg itself. As Henry and his colleagues debated their political future, enslaved people's actions heightened the anxieties of white Virginians. As we've said before, we know that things often escalated in Massachusetts a bit more rapidly than they did in Virginia, and this is really important to the story. So picture this: Massachusetts, winter of 1774 into winter of 1775. It's tense, and it's getting tenser. The British Crown has put a hard stop on military supplies. No new gunpowder, no fresh weapons, nothing. Royal governors across North America also understand the assignment is to secure whatever is already in the colonies. The colonists definitely see what's coming, and they're not about to sit back and let the British tighten their grip.
You see that colonists know that the British are going to start confiscating military supplies, or at least gaining more control over them. And so they start getting antsy about getting their hands on those military supplies before the British have the chance to secure them. Keeping in mind, for the most part, most of these military supplies are British or colonial government supplies. It's just a matter of securing them. Before, some of these supplies were in magazines, guardhouses, or forts that only might have, 5 or 10 soldiers attending to them, because this is a time of peace. The last war is 10 years old. So there's not a lot of worry about securing this stuff. But now the British authorities are going to start getting better control over it. And so the colonists are starting to act before the British had the opportunity.
We see it in December 1774 when the New Hampshire militia storms Fort William and Mary, snatching up gunpowder and cannons before the British can move them. And then in September, there's the powder alarm. British troops quietly remove gunpowder from a magazine in Somerville, Massachusetts. But as soon as locals realize what's happened, the countryside erupts. Armed men pour into the streets. No shots are fired, but the message is clear. The colonists are ready. And by February 1775, things heat up again, this time in Salem, Massachusetts.
In February of 1775, the British sent an expedition to Salem, Massachusetts to do a similar thing. They had heard there were gunpowder and cannon being hidden in the town of Salem that they were going to seize and get control of. They showed up. The militia found out they were coming right at the same time. They were able to hide the supplies, and they came out and opposed the British expedition with arms. And it was this very tense standoff, and the violence was averted right at the last second when the British commander said, I have orders where I have to march across this bridge and search this house, and I'm not going to leave until you let me do that. And the local militia commander said, okay, you can do that, but then you immediately have to turn around and leave, knowing they had already moved the supplies from the house. So is this kind of wink, wink, nod, nod. We know that this is useless, but I have to do this to save face. And luckily violence was averted, but this was now the local Massachusetts militia used their force and guns to prevent the British Army from doing something. So now they're kind of emboldened, right? They know that maybe the British don't want to start a war. And so if we are aggressive in our resistance to them, maybe we can get away with a lot more.
But not for long. Fast forward to April 1775. General Thomas Gage, military governor of Massachusetts, gets explicit orders from London: crack down. Arrest revolutionary leaders like Samuel Adams and John Hancock. Show the colonist who's in charge. Gage had been fairly cautious up until this point. He wanted to ensure that he was not trampling on the rights of colonists, and he did not want to provoke any conflict. But now he had these explicit orders to be more aggressive. At the same time, Gage gets word there's a stockpile of weapons in Concord, and a rumor spreads that the Massachusetts Provisional Congress is rallying support for a full-blown army. Gage knows he has to move fast. He's not really concerned with having the supplies himself. It's more about making sure that the colonists can't get their hands on them. Gage sends an expedition of roughly 700 soldiers from Boston in the middle of the night. They were meant to march to Concord and capture and destroy the military supplies that were supposedly hidden there, or take them back to Boston. Here's the thing, though. Boston's British troops, they aren't exactly operating under the radar.
So Gage sends this expedition to Concord. They're on their way to Concord, and in between is a small town of Lexington. And the Lexington militia had heard the British expedition was on their way, even though Gage tried to keep the expedition super secret. word got out because there are 4,000 soldiers in this major city that many people did not like them being there. So they were constantly being watched, and it was impossible to keep a secret. And it's important to, on that note too, is the colonists' tensions were very high. Colonists knew that the British had already had these two other expeditions, right? To Somerville, to Salem, to seize gunpowder. They knew the British were doing this kind of thing. And so in the month of April, Paul Revere actually went on 2 previous rides to alert the countryside that the British were about to march out and seize supplies or try to capture John Hancock and Samuel Adams. They were worried they would be arrested, so they had already fled Boston at the beginning of April. They were hiding in Lexington, coincidentally enough. So everybody in the countryside were ready for this to happen. There had been 2 previous alarms.
The moment they step out, the alarm starts spreading, and within hours, the countryside is awake, armed, and ready.
When the expedition does finally get going, it does not take very long for that word to get out. Paul Revere does famously slip out of Boston in the middle of the night and go on his famous ride. He's not doing that alone, however. He's with 2 other people who also are riding and raising the alarm. And then also, once word gets out, people in the countryside are like very interested in what's about to happen. And so they all wake up and they all tell their friends and they all go to neighboring towns. So it's very quickly, even without Paul Revere, I think the word would have gotten out. And the revolutionaries in Boston had prepared for that. When Paul Revere tried to get out of the city, he had to sneakily row his boat across the harbor. And there was a big chance he would have been captured. So they didn't want to put all of their eggs in their Paul Revere basket. They had other colonists ready to ride out and spread the alarm.
By the time the British reach Lexington at dawn, a small militia is waiting. The British order them to disperse, and most do. But then a shot rings out, and that's all it takes. The British open fire.
As history will never know, a shot does ring out. It could have been a misfire. That's what happened earlier in the day as the British approached Lexington. A colonial militiaman had shot his gun near the British army, whether it was a misfire, whether he shot and missed. So the British were already kind of primed at that. And that was a common thing with 18th century firearms. Your gun goes off by accident. But whatever happens, a shot rings out. The British open fire. They kill 8 Massachusetts militiamen on Lexington Green. They shoot back. They wound a couple of British soldiers.
8 militia members die, and the British keep marching towards Concord. Once they get to Concord, though, things escalate a lot. As the British search for weapons, the colonial militia, now hundreds strong, watches from the hills.
A much larger body of Massachusetts militia gather. Several hundred men are gathering and watching the British as they're searching the town, trying to destroy supplies. When the British start burning some supplies that they've found, it looks like the town of Concord is being set on fire. And so the militia who are on a hill outside of town say, why are we here if not to stop this, basically? So they decide to then march down and confront the British. The British open fire as they are marching towards them. And that is when the larger battle then really starts, is at Concord. And when Ralph Waldo Emerson writes his poem in 1837 to commemorate the Battle of Concord, that's what he writes about with the shot heard around the world. It's because he himself was from Concord. And so he is saying that that first confrontation across the North Bridge in Concord was the shot heard around the world.
From there, it's chaos. As the British retreat towards Boston, militia from all over swarm the roads, firing from behind trees, stone walls, houses. It's brutal. By the time the British finally drag themselves back into Boston, after nearly 24 hours of marching and fighting, they've lost 15% of their force.
For an 18th century battle, that's a lot. The colonists lose about 49 men killed, about 42 wounded. And out of their 4,000 men that fought that day, it's only about 2%. So if you look at it, it was very much a militia victory. They inflicted a lot of casualties on the British. And this is very embarrassing for the British, too. They went out, they accomplished virtually nothing, and they were horribly bloodied by the militia. So it's a big deal for both those reasons. It's bloody and large numbers of men are involved.
There are now 10 to 15,000 militiamen encamped outside the city of Boston. The British in Boston are now besieged. This is no longer just resistance. It's war. Word spreads to the other colonies. It took about 10 days to reach Virginia and 3 weeks to work its way to Georgia. A month later, word finally makes its way to Great Britain. Both the British and the colonists know controlling the narrative is key. British commander Thomas Gage sent his report back to England, but the colonists got their version there first, 2 weeks earlier, shaping public opinion before the British response even arrived. For pro-American politicians in Britain, this was more proof that British authority was out of control in the colonies. But for Parliament and the King, it was confirmation of rebellion. Their response? Double down, send more troops. And soon, this fight wouldn't just be Massachusetts' problem. While everyone focuses on Lexington and Concord, there's another flashpoint that happens in Virginia, one that has nothing to do with Massachusetts directly, but everything to do with the broader issue at hand. On April 21st, 1775, a fuse was lit amongst Virginia's patriots. They aren't reacting to the war kicking off in earnest up north. After all, they didn't even know about it yet. They are, however, reacting to the same thing that's been making tensions explode all over the colonies: gunpowder. As we've seen, British authorities have been securing arms and colonial revolutionaries have been trying to grab them first. And now Lord Dunmore is playing the same game.
So debates and conflict over gunpowder is on people's minds leading into the spring of 1775. In Virginia, Lord Dunmore, in April of 1775, asks the keeper of the public magazine in Williamsburg to give him the key to the magazine. And the keeper very quickly tells the local mayor and council of Williamsburg that the governor has asked him for the key. So they know that Dunmore is thinking about the gunpowder. He's thinking about the magazine. And they authorize a guard to watch the magazine because they don't want Dunmore to do anything. So from April 16th, there is a volunteer force watching the magazine at night. But 4 days pass, nothing happens, and they get bored. And they don't want to stay out at night watching the magazine for nothing to happen. On the night of April 20th and early morning hours of April the 21st, there was a rainstorm. And so the guards say, we're going home. And Dunmore had somebody watching the watchers. So he was waiting for his opportunity. And when he hears that the guard had gone home for the night, he knew he had to act. So the early morning hours of April the 21st, 1775, Dunmore sends word to Lieutenant Henry Collins, who was an officer on board the HMS Magdalen, which is a British schooner in the James River by Burwell's Ferry, at a landing point on the James River. Dunmore had already told Collins to have his men ready for this mission. So when he hears that the guard had left, he sends word to Collins to execute the mission that we had already discussed. Collins gets his men together, 20 men. They are armed. Some are Marines from the ship. Some are just sailors. And they march into Williamsburg with a wagon, and they go to Williamsburg's gunpowder magazine. They open the magazine with the key that they have, and they start removing 15 half barrels, basically like mini barrels of gunpowder. However, as they are doing this, somebody in town sees them and they raise the alarm. So Collins and his men start working more quickly because they want to get out of town before any conflict arises. And they do. They get out, they get back to their ship, they load everything aboard the ship, and the event is over. But Dunmore knew that this was going to cause a ruckus. And it did, because that morning, a crowd of several hundred gather. Many of them are armed, and they are mad, and they are demanding that Dunmore return the gunpowder. And they are protesting on the Governor Palace Green, right outside his house, saying, you need to come out here and talk to us about this. Local town leaders led by Peyton Randolph, whose home is right across from the magazine and right next to the governor's palace. He and other moderate politicians want to diffuse the situation. So they say, everybody, hold up. We're going to go speak to Dunmore and figure out why he did this, what's happening. So they meet with Dunmore. They explain that they are confused as to why he removed the gunpowder. They would like him to return it or explain why he took it away. And Dunmore reasoning to why he removed the gunpowder was he was doing it to secure the gunpowder from the threat of a slave insurrection.
This threat of a slave insurrection was a real thing that colonists had in the front of their minds. Ever since slavery existed in the colonies, colonists recognized that enslaved peoples were one of their biggest threats. And in the time of war, they were very aware that any enemy, any combatant could free their enslaved population and use those people against them. So this is a real threat in the eyes of the colonists. But at the same time, Lord Dunmore is sort of using this as an easy excuse. He knows that the colonists are thinking about taking away the gunpowder and using it to arm the illegal militias that they have just approved the creation of. And so he uses this threat of a slave insurrection to sort of get under their skin and justify his actions.
So Dunmore blames these threats of slave insurrection for why he removed the gunpowder. But the colonists, when they think about it, they're like, wait a second. If there's going to be a slave revolt, why did you remove the gunpowder that we would theoretically need to protect ourselves from this revolt? And Dunmore says, well, I would bring it back immediately as soon as you needed it. But also, you are all armed on my lawn right now. You do not seem like somebody I would want to give gunpowder to. So at the same time, he is saying that, oh, don't worry. I am doing this for your actual protection. I will make sure to give it to you when you need it. But do you really need it right now? Because it seems like you would use it for other purposes. So those moderates that go and talk to Dunmore, and Dunmore is like, oh, don't worry, I'm doing it to protect you. They come back and they like spin it in a way to tell the armed mob that like, it's okay. We're working it out with Dunmore. We're going to figure this out. Please go home. Because these moderates, like Peyton Randolph, really does not want armed conflict. His number one thing is to do this peacefully. So he wants them to all go away. And they do. They listen for a little bit. The big mob in the morning goes away. But then there's other rumors. Oh, no, there are these British warships, in the York and the James River. There's rumors that sailors are coming into town. What are they doing? There's rumors of slave revolt. So they quickly gather again that evening. Again, they're armed men from the surrounding counties start coming into Williamsburg because they hear what happened. So things are getting more and more kind of chaotic and out of control. And the next day is really when things go south for Lord Dunmore.
Taking the gunpowder was certainly scandalous, but it's not something Dunmore couldn't have come back from. But Dunmore was known to be sort of full of himself, and he was known to not like to have his authority challenged. He wasn't quite ready to let this go.
All these armed people yelling at him is really getting under his skin. And he was like calm a little bit, but the next day he loses it. And he's talking to a Williamsburg councilman and gets on the subject of these protests, and he explodes. And he tells this councilman that if any harm or continued insults come to any royal official, so not just himself, but any of his other royal officials or British Army officers in the area, then, quote, by the living God, I will declare freedom to the slaves and reduce the city of Williamsburg to ashes. I have once fought for the Virginians, and by God, I will let them see that I can fight against them. So I don't think you could say anything more incendiary.
Dunmore's threats very quickly get out, and they spread throughout the colony.
You see hundreds of armed men start gathering in Fredericksburg. 600 to 2,000 militiamen of these independent companies gather in Fredericksburg, and they're saying, we're going to march to Williamsburg and confront Dunmore. And it's only from the exertions of the moderate politicians like Peyton Randolph that stop them from doing so. That Fredericksburg group received several letters from Williamsburg, and they're like, don't come. because we don't want to see if Dunmore is bluffing or not. We are the residents of Williamsburg. It's easy for you in Fredericksburg to feel militant and want to march and save us. But if Dunmore is going to burn our city down, we don't want to experience that. And they ignore him. They ignore those letters. It's not until Virginia's delegation to the Second Continental Congress, which again is meeting in just a couple days in Philadelphia. So the Virginians are leaving Williamsburg on their way to Philadelphia. They stop in Fredericksburg and personally assure those militiamen that you don't need to go to Williamsburg. Dunmore is just bluffing. We're going to work this all out. Please go home. And they finally do.
They may have gone home, but there was still trouble brewing.
So that group in Fredericksburg goes home, but not everybody listens. So there was a group in Albemarle County that was forming, and they said, we're not going home. We're going to march to Williamsburg, whether you moderate politicians tell us we don't need to or not. And so they start marching towards Williamsburg, and they get to Hanover County and meet up with our good friend, Mr. Patrick Henry. Because while Patrick Henry was a delegate to the Second Continental Congress, he was not joining his colleagues and going to Fredericksburg and asking the militia to disperse, because he was gathering his own militia in Hanover to march to Williamsburg to confront Dunmore. So Henry gathers several hundred of his own men from Hanover. They join up with those Albemarle folks. Some other local counties join, and they say, we are marching to Williamsburg. They actually start to do it, and they start marching down the Virginia Peninsula. They get about 15 miles outside of town. And at that point, Dunmore doubles down. He says, I don't know if you remember what I threatened to do, but if you get any closer, I am going to do it. It's not like he made that threat in a pit of fashion and then is like, oh, I'm so sorry. I didn't mean it. I was just angry. He doubles down and says, all those threats that I made earlier, I'm going to actually do them if you get any closer to Williamsburg. So Patrick Henry is marching towards Williamsburg, and he's going to demand that Dunmore return the gunpowder or at least pay for the gunpowder. He stops his group at a town outside of Williamsburg, and they actually send a detachment to go kidnap the treasurer of the colony of Virginia to make him pay for the gunpowder. Luckily, the treasurer was at the governor's palace at that time, so he avoided kidnapping. But in Williamsburg, Dunmore was worried that a battle was about to happen. He sends his wife and children out of the city to a British warship. He requests sailors and Marines from those British warships come into Williamsburg, and they start fortifying the governor's palace into a fort. They are going to battle it out in the governor's palace if Henry comes into town. And so all the moderate politicians are freaking out. They're like, this is not good because Patrick Henry is not listening to us. And so they finally come to a last minute agreement where these moderate politicians convince Dunmore to issue a promissory note to say that we'll pay for the gunpowder if Henry agrees to go home. And Henry really, I think, was spoiling for a fight. That's why he was not listening to any of those moderates. He wanted this confrontation, but he sees this as good enough. And so he takes that receipt, which we have in our collection here at the museum, and he promises to give that money to the Continental Congress delegation for them to purchase military supplies for Virginia's defense. And then they march home. So at the very last minute, this conflict was avoided, but it was a very close thing. Henry continues to be this leading reactionary, kind of at the forefront of taking militant action. And you see his contemporaries will say, we like your ideas, but you need to maybe slow down on your actions, because it's this great push and pull. So this revolution is this inherently radical thing, but it's being led by inherently moderate people. So they are interested in pushing the revolution forward, but doing so to ensure that they maintain control and quote unquote law and order over the colony. So they don't lose it to the masses of the people. They don't lose the inherent structure of what has made them wealthy and powerful.
There you have it. By the spring of 1775, tensions in Virginia were high and getting higher. although the situation was still a little calmer than what was happening up north. Unlike in Massachusetts, where large populations were concentrated in towns that were relatively close together, which meant that battles like Lexington and Concord could escalate quickly, Virginia's more spread out communities made mobilizing for conflict a slower process, but it's definitely coming. Patrick Henry emerged as one of the most forceful voices pushing for action, especially after Royal Governor Lord Dunmore removed gunpowder from the Williamsburg magazine. But what really set Virginians off were Dunmore's threats to free and arm enslaved people against the colonists. Dunmore himself admitted later that his words struck a nerve, one that he would continue to exploit. He wrote to Lord Dartmouth in England stating, "The declaration that I would arm and set free such slaves as should assist me if I was attacked stirred up fears in them, which cannot easily subside." Henry, meanwhile, was officially labeled a rebel. Dunmore declared him an outlaw, calling for his arrest, which only deepened the divide. And then the news from Lexington and Concord arrived. For Henry, it was proof of everything he had been saying. "We are at war," he declared. But many in Virginia still weren't sure if they wanted to go all in. So, was war inevitable from the moment the first shots were fired? Not necessarily. In the summer of 1775, the Second Continental Congress still sought reconciliation, even sending the Olive Branch petition to the king. There was a chance, however slim, to prevent an all-out revolution. But on the ground, events were moving at a different pace. Colonists in Massachusetts were authorizing attacks on British forts and even discussing an invasion of Canada. While political leaders hesitated, the reality of war was already setting in. Across the colonies, the sense of revolution wasn't uniform. In New England, Lexington and Concord had already cemented radical action, while places like Virginia were still months behind in breaking with British rule. Congress, acting as the unifying force, had to move at the pace of its slowest members, making the road to independence a gradual and uneven process. This revolutionary spring of 1775 ignites a flame that will soon engulf the 13 colonies in the fight for independence. From the first shots at Lexington and Concord to the rising tide of rebellion, this is only the beginning of the story. That wraps up this season, but don't go anywhere. There's much more to come. Stay tuned as we continue the journey through the American Revolution, uncovering the battles, the people, and the moments that shaped a nation. If you enjoyed this episode, be sure to subscribe, leave a review, and share it with your friends. For more episodes and resources, including the primary sources mentioned in this episode, check out our website at virginiahistory.org/podcast.
Thanks for listening to Revolution Revisited. The American Revolution was not an ending, but a beginning. The stories continue to unfold. Subscribe now and catch the next episode for another journey through history. This podcast is made possible by William and Karen Fralin and presented by the Virginia Museum of History and Culture.
Revolution Revisited is a production of the Virginia Museum of History and Culture. Our production staff includes Haley Finner, Maggie Creech, Nicole Martirana, and Tracy Schneider. Be sure to subscribe to get notified about upcoming episodes. Thanks for listening, and we'll see you next time.
Explore 16,000 years of Virginia history. The Virginia Museum of History and Culture offers a variety of exhibitions, public programs, and special events for the whole family. Learn more and plan your visit at virginiahistory.org.